A quiet night erupts into chaos as flames consume an apartment building.
He was going up and down the hall, banging on people's doors.
One apartment had flames coming out the window.
This apartment was fully engulfed.
Is it an accident or something much more sinister?
Police found an unidentified body within that apartment.
Was this fire set on purpose to cover up evidence?
The autopsy reveals a vicious death.
Hemorrhages in her brain wasn't anything related to the fire.
What they also find in the lungs is very telling.
She was essentially burned alive.
As the investigation unfolds, one suspect stands out.
They end up uncovering a troubling past.
These certain women, men, family members, friends.
They're discovering just how gruesome, how brutal, how horrendous this crime was.
And when the truth is revealed, it leaves everyone in disbelief.
No one could have foresaw that things would have ended this way.
She tried to help the wrong person.
Her heart cost her her life.
July 12th, 2018. It's just after midnight in Chicago, Illinois, when sirens are heard responding to a fire on the city's south side in the neighborhood of Englewood.
Englewood, it's changed over the years.
In the 60s, it was a hot spot for civil rights marches, Black businesses, gatherings. But as time went on, it became a little dilapidated.
It was a high drug crime area, and then other people started moving in, and they put really nice apartments. That neighborhood completely did a 360.
But tonight, there are flames coming from an Englewood apartment.
The fire was in an apartment building with 9 units and about a dozen people living there.
By the time the fire department got there, most people were out in front.
The fire is burning in a second-story apartment.
The fire, even though it is attempting to spread, is kind of confined to one unit.
This apartment was fully engulfed. The heat in there was so intense.
But the heat doesn't stop the firefighters.
The fire was coming from the bedroom.
They were able to pretty rapidly battle the fire down and knock it down.
As they do, the firefighters make a gruesome discovery.
What they find is the body of a Black woman laying there.
In between the bed and the wall is a very badly burned body.
They suspect it's the woman who lives in the apartment.
The resident of the apartment was 38-year-old Tayonda Hall.
To her friends and family, Tayonda was known as Lucky.
Lucky is a nickname that was given to her when she was little because she got away with a lot. And she never really got reprimanded or disciplined for anything that she did. So our grandfather actually started calling her Lucky because she was always lucky she didn't get a butt whooping.
It was hard for anyone to get mad at Tayonda.
She was just a really fun person to be around.
She was the life of the party, and people just were drawn to her.
In her 30s, Tayonda found a career that was a perfect fit for her personality.
She was a bar star. She was a popular bartender around a lot of different bars around Chicago and in the surrounding suburbs.
It didn't matter where she was bartending. People would come from across the city to see her. People would come from out of town to see her. She was just this energy.
And she knew how to connect with the people she was serving.
She was someone that people could confide in.
She always had sympathy for them because she'd had struggles of her own.
Tayonda Hall had her first child at 17.
Tayonda had boyfriends. She'd even been married, but none of those relationships lasted, so she was a single mother.
She was a mom to a 21-year-old and an 18-year-old, and the youngest, a 14-year-old.
Lucky was no stranger to loss either.
Once Tayonda lost her mother to breast cancer, her life was changed forever.
We literally kind of just watched her waste away as she was fighting. I think the hardest thing for Lucky was not being able to do anything about it.
After her mother's death, Tayonda tried to fill the void that was left in the family.
She stepped up into the role of matriarch in her family. She was the glue that held it all together.
She would always try to keep everybody involved and around each other.
Our mom's death just woke up this new person. I literally watched her become a bigger person. This person that put everybody else before her. It was a beautiful thing to watch.
Tayonda was as devoted to her community as she was to her family.
She started really focusing on how she can bring awareness to the community about breast cancer. She would have events, she would bring people in, and she really focused on being able to make a difference.
She would give you a place to stay. She would give you food to eat. She would give you clothing, whatever it was. She would make sure that you were okay.
She moved the whole family of 5 into our 1-bedroom apartment because they didn't have nowhere to go, and they stayed with us for 2-3 months.
And it was that selfless generosity that brought Tayonda Hall and Wes Arnold together.
Tayonda meets Wes at the bar. She starts talking to him, and what she realizes is that he's also in need of help.
He walked into her bar as a regular, and he asked her to help him with his resume.
She started helping him get his life together, which is what Lucky is known to do. She was helping him vamp up his resume and setting up job interviews and taking him shopping.
She's really trying to help him, but once they start spending some time together, things take a little bit of a turn and become romantic.
It was an 1.5-hour drive to Inglewood from Waukegan, where Wes lived, but he was making the drive more often.
They had gotten close and had been dating for a little bit, maybe a few months, and he had actually started spending time with her more and more at the house.
Wes gave Tayonda the one thing that was missing from her life.
At this time in her life, she is divorced. She has 2 grown children. She's co-parenting a younger child. And she really wasn't looking for love, but thought, why not? Let's just see what happens.
What was happening was the start of a whole new chapter in Tayonda's life.
They were even talking about Wes moving to be closer to Lucky because she said she would live there till the day she died.
Now it looks as if Tayonda's prediction has come true. When, as firefighters put out flames inside her apartment, they uncover a woman's badly burned body.
She's on the side of the bed against the wall, severely burnt.
And the firefighters are wondering if they're looking at a crime scene.
Maybe this fire was not an accident.
When they entered the front door of the apartment, it looked like it had been kicked in.
This fire was set to conceal something a lot more sinister.
38-year-old Chicago bartender Tayonda Lucky Hall had opened her heart to a new chance for love with one of her regulars, Wes Arnold.
She starts to become friends with him. They start working on his resume together.
She was helping him find jobs, checking in with him as he came into her bar.
Soon, Wes was driving from his home in Waukegan to see Tayonda, not just at the bar where she worked, but at her Southside Chicago apartment.
It was a fairly new relationship, but he had been spending quite a bit of time down here where her residence is.
But now firefighters have made a horrific discovery inside her apartment.
They found the badly burned body of a woman lying on the floor between the bed and the wall.
Tayonda lived in this apartment, leading them to believe that this is her body.
And first responders suspect her death might not be an accident.
There were clear signs of forced entry when the firefighters arrived.
Certain things weren't really beginning to add up.
When the detective arrives, he makes more suspicious discoveries inside the charred apartment.
In the bedroom, there's a stun gun on the floor that was damaged by the fire, which is kind of an unusual place for that.
And items on a table in the living room suggest the victim wasn't alone before she died.
A couple liquor bottles, 4 wine glasses, there was cards. Those things suggested the possibility that there had been at least 4 people in the apartment. So that broadens your perspective on possible suspects and also possible witnesses.
Then something stops the investigators dead in their tracks.
The police are looking around the apartment. They hear a hissing sound.
They find that one of the burners on the stove is turned on. So even though the stove is not burning, there is gas.
They immediately turn off the gas and breathe a sigh of relief.
With the gas being on in the stove, there was definitely a possibility of an explosion event.
We could have been talking about a much larger tragedy with multiple casualties and multiple lives lost.
While the medical examiner's team arrives to evaluate the remains, a detective begins questioning the neighbors gathered outside the building.
They have multiple people coming up to them, giving them accounts of things that they've heard, things that they've seen.
It wasn't one of the situations where we knock on a door and nobody answers. Everybody was out there, and they were forthcoming as far as information.
They're hoping that these accounts will lead them in the right direction to figure out what happened.
Their accounts of terror and confusion are similar, but they also offer up an intriguing detail from before the fire even began.
The neighbors related hearing maybe 20, 30 minutes before the fire, a door slamming and at least a couple people running down the stairs from the second floor.
Shortly after hearing the footsteps flee, one neighbor says he noticed his room getting warmer.
So he goes out of the apartment and realizes that his neighbor's apartment is ablaze.
The fire alarms are not working. So at this point, the residents have become the fire alarm.
The first thing he did do was go next door, banging on the door. He didn't get any response.
Tayonda, come outside.
He realizes that he needs to kick the door down because there's a fire inside and there's someone living there.
He actually did kick the door in, but the fire and the smoke was too intense, so he wasn't able to actually go in and try and check on his neighbor.
He realizes all he can do is make sure everyone else is alerted to get out of the apartments.
It's a very terrifying thing, as anybody might imagine. Just the sound of people banging on your door, get out, fire.
Well, you did the right thing.
But Tayonda's neighbor isn't so sure.
But maybe if I went in.
But inside, as the medical examiner's team moves her body, they uncover shocking new evidence.
They find blood under her body that hadn't been damaged by the fire.
Tayonda had been lying there bleeding before the fire was started.
While removing what they believe to be the body of Tayonda Lucky Hall from her Southside Chicago apartment, the medical examiner's team has found evidence that the 38-year-old bartender and mother of 3 was murdered.
They find blood under her body that hadn't been damaged by the fire,
which changes their perspective when examining her injuries.
Even though the body was severely burned from the apartment fire, the ME could see that she had what appeared to be injuries from multiple blows to the head.
She had lacerations on her face.
The face is misshapen. The jaw is out of place. There are gashes on the skin.
That was a very violent beating that she took.
A beating that savage suggested that the attacker had feelings of intense rage, which would mean that the motive was personal.
So it was likely someone who knew her.
Investigators had already found empty liquor bottles and glasses on a table in the apartment. And neighbors told the police they heard people running down the steps.
About 20 or 30 minutes before the fire, they hear footsteps, almost like running away from the apartment.
Who were the people the neighbors heard? And what is their connection to Tayanda? Looking for answers, the detective turns to the building's landlord.
The landlord actually lived in the building, so he'd seen Tayanda around. But he told the investigators he didn't know a whole lot about her.
She had only been there just a few months.
As far as the landlord knew, she lived alone.
In recent weeks, however, he has noticed someone coming over to her apartment frequently.
He said this guy's been coming around for the last couple weeks.
However, he doesn't know much about him.
After talking to the landlord, the detective reaches out to Tayanda's family and discovers they've already heard about the fire.
My cousin called me. She was like, your mama's house on fire, and she's not answering the phone.
My father came in the room and he sat down on the edge of my bed and was just like, Tavion, I got some news.
Tayanda's family is devastated.
But though they want to help the investigation, they don't know much about Lucky's private life or her boyfriend.
The relationship had probably only been maybe 4 to 5 months.
I had no idea who he was. I didn't know what he looked like.
They really wanted to help, they just didn't have the information.
But the situation is made clearer when police speak with 2 of Tayanda's friends, Jocelyn and Isaiah.
Those 2 people said, hey, we were there the night of the fire.
The people that were there the night of the incident were my mom's close friends. I believe she met them through working at the bar.
To shed more light on that evening, they agreed to come in for an interview.
They said we were invited over there. They were playing a game for shots, some kind of card game.
And Tayanda had her new boyfriend there.
Tayanda introduced him as Wes Arnold. Finally, the detectives get a name.
But he wasn't what they'd expected.
They reported that the boyfriend seemed very aggressive and belligerent, and they were very uncomfortable with him.
There was a lot of tension in the air.
He was weird. He was just being very controlling.
The tension was too much for Jocelyn and Isaiah.
Jocelyn and Isaiah decide, you know what, it's probably time to bounce, time to leave.
But when they were preparing to leave, one of them had actually asked her if they could borrow $50.
Yeah, no problem.
My mom always thought about others before herself. If she could help, she would.
Tayanda kept some of her bartending tips in a special rainy day fund.
Every time she get a $5 bill, she'll put it up to the side just in case anyone might need it.
And so Lucky goes to her stash.
At that point, the new boyfriend, who they had never met before tonight, became increasingly angered and said, we're not going to give you $50, possibly $20.
As they stood there, unsure how to react, Tayanda came back, looking perplexed.
She actually discovered that it was missing.
She couldn't find the money.
Hey, what's wrong? It's gone.
Friends of bartender Tayanda Lucky Hall have just said that on the night of her murder, things were tense between Tayanda and her boyfriend, Wes Arnold.
Jocelyn and Isaiah had been in Lucky's apartment with her new boyfriend that they had met for the first time, playing cards.
He was arguing with her throughout the night, and it was just an awkward interaction for everybody.
As Isaiah and Jocelyn were about to leave, they asked if Tayanda had some cash to spare.
She would get tips from the bar, and she kept that in her little rainy day stash fund.
But Tayanda discovered that the money was gone.
It's gone.
What do you think happened to it?
Well, I think he took it. At least that's what Lucky thought.
There wasn't any direct accusation at the time to Wes, but they could tell she was upset, and this new person in her life would have been a suspect.
At this point, Lucky kind of signaled for her friends, it was time for you to go.
Tayanda's friends were only too glad to get away.
The neighbor said that he thought he had heard two people slam the door and running from the apartment. That might have been explained by them leaving hastily.
And they never expected what would happen next.
When Isaiah and Jocelyn left, they didn't feel that Tayanda would be in any harm or anything. And when they discovered what had happened, they were truly in shock.
But are they telling the truth?
As convincing as their story was, it was still possible that they were putting Wes at the scene just to divert attention from themselves.
Trying to find out more about Wes, they run his name through their database.
They discover some things that are quite troubling.
He was involved in a shooting in early 2000s. One of our detectives brought him down to the station and he admitted to his involvement in that shooting and went to prison for some weapons violations. And then it just kept stemming from there.
One incident in particular catches the detective's attention.
He punched a woman so hard that she needed 17 stitches.
There's a troubling pattern in Wes's behavior.
If you look at all the cases he had, it was always the same. They were getting along, everything was fine. Then he snapped into an instant rage.
Even more disturbing is the fact that many of the victims of Wes's rage were women.
We also find in his background a lot of domestic violence charges.
Was Tayanda just his latest victim?
They know that they need to find Wes Arnold quickly to determine if he had something to do with this.
But before they can reach out to him, the detective gets word that the results of the autopsy are in.
Homicide. Okay.
The first thing the report does is give a positive identity to the victim.
The medical examiner has to identify Tayanda Hall through dental records.
The autopsy also confirms that Tayanda was the victim of a savage beating.
Lucky was beaten so ferociously that her jaw was broken and kind of unhinged. There was multiple cuts and bruises on her face.
A fractured and dislocated jaw. That's something that you don't get from a fire.
But the brutality of the beating isn't even the most tragic finding in the autopsy.
Those injuries may not be her cause of death.
She was living at the time that the fire happened because unfortunately we did find soot in her trachea, which basically means that she breathed in this hot air.
She had 37% carbon monoxide in her system, which indicates that she was very much alive and did not, in fact, die from the brutal injuries. She was essentially burned alive.
It's a horrible discovery, one that speaks to the cold-heartedness of her killer.
She was incapacitated by several blows to the head and then left in that state while the apartment was set on fire.
The autopsy results convinced the investigators that Tayanda was killed by her boyfriend.
It seemed pretty straightforward to me that this was an act of partner violence, just given the intimacy of it and the injuries that I saw.
Wes Arnold is most likely the perpetrator, and they need to close in on him. They don't want him out there striking again.
We send out, Bolo, be on the lookout, emails to our patrol division and say, hey, here's his picture, he's wanted, suspicion of homicide. We started getting all that out there, just so that if anyone sees him, we can grab him.
But as the detective begins the search, it seems no one has a clue where Wes could be.
They discovered that he was on parole, but he had not been checking in with his parole officer.
A guy like Wes is going to hang out with whatever girl he's dating, whatever buddy will let him flop on the couch for the night.
Days turn into weeks, and the detective is still no closer to finding him.
He's never in one place. He has nowhere really to call home. He has no apartment, nothing in his name.
Police are stuck between a rock and a hard place at this point. They have a name, they have a description, but they don't really have any other viable information to go on.
Until about a month after the murder, police get a phone call.
They get a call from a woman reporting a domestic violence incident that just occurred in her home.
She is reporting that she has sustained some abuse by her boyfriend.
But this is no routine domestic assault complaint.
The woman said the police were already looking for her boyfriend.
She asked him a question about being on the run, and he knocked her unconscious.
Her boyfriend is Wes Arnold.
Yes, please. I need the police.
A woman has just contacted police about a domestic violence incident involving her boyfriend, Wes Arnold, who's also the prime suspect in the murder of Chicago bartender Tayonda Lucky Hall.
The reason she's calling is because her and Wes have gotten into a physical altercation, and he hit her so hard that it knocked her unconscious.
Dispatchers inform the Chicago homicide detective investigating Tayonda's case.
Homicide.
It had been just a month since Wes's previous girlfriend was found dead in her burning apartment after being severely beaten.
So the detective contacts Wes's new girlfriend to get the full story.
She tells police that she has only known Wes Arnold for about a month.
It was good.
She explained that the relationship started out great, like most do.
But everything changed when he moved in with her.
They were in the home together, and she started to realize that something just wasn't right about him.
She felt things were off with Wes Arnold. Some things that he seemed very elusive about.
Wes eventually told her that he was on parole.
She asked him, "Why aren't you checking in with your parole officer?" At that point, he let it be known that the Chicago Police Department was looking for him. It was clear that he was using her place as sort of a hideout.
Why are you on the run?
I don't want to talk about it.
You know what? I don't want the police coming around here, so you need to leave.
That's when Wes snapped.
He became physically aggressive, slapping her, hitting her.
And he actually knocked her unconscious.
Even once she was unconscious, he continued to beat her, which was eerily similar to what had happened in Lucky's case.
His girlfriend tells the detective that when she finally came to, Wes was gone.
She realized that not only did he beat her, he had taken her debit cards.
He ends up taking her keys, he takes her phone, her credit cards, and then he goes back on the run again.
It was only after the assault that his girlfriend found out that Wes was suspected of killing Tayonda Hall.
It became very clear to her that this man was incredibly dangerous, and that if she did not speak up, that she too could potentially be harmed in a way that she could not come back from.
She came forward because she wanted him off the streets so he couldn't hurt anyone else.
But she has no idea where he could be now.
Keeping tabs on him. A guy like that's hard. He's transient. His family wouldn't let him live with them.
They don't know where to look or to find him.
But suddenly, that changes.
On the evening of August 29th, police spotted a suspicious subject on the street corner, and he matched the description of Wes Arnold.
The officer calls in for backup, and police respond to the location quietly.
A couple of my guys showed up there, and they walked up to him with a soft approach.
They find him coming out of a liquor store, and they approach him.
Are you having issues with those guys over there?
Oh, hell no.
Why are they yelling at you?
They're not yelling at me.
The police don't let Wes know they're looking for him.
He is a big guy, you know, if we don't have to fight him, even better.
What's your name, sir?
He gives a fake name.
But it's the name of a real person.
The name that Wes has given actually has a warrant out in the system.
Am I okay?
No, actually, it's not. Put your hands on the hood.
Our guys just kept playing it off. And they said, okay, well, we're gonna have to take you into custody for this warrant and then verify that you're him.
By the time Wes realizes he's being played, it's too late.
He kind of pauses and he says, "You know who I am already."
You don't know who I am?
I know who you are. Come on, Wes, stop playing.
He's just very calm. He's not putting up a fight or anything.
As violent as Wes was with people, he never really had a history of violence with us as the police. All our interactions where we arrested him, surprisingly, he didn't fight us.
This arrest is no exception.
Sometimes you gotta be smart enough to know when you're gonna win and you're gonna lose.
Police arrange for Wes to be interviewed by a homicide detective.
In his interview, he admits that he was at Tayanda's the night of the fire, along with two of her friends, Jocelyn and Isaiah.
Wes says they'd all had a lot to drink.
They were playing the game for shots. So if you lost, they were drinking.
But he says he doesn't know anything about Tayanda's death.
He completely denies that he has anything to do with it.
He claims she was very much alive when he left the apartment.
However, Wes does admit the atmosphere was tense in the apartment that night. But not between him and Tayanda.
Wes said it was Jocelyn he had a problem with.
He says Lucky's friend Jocelyn was kind of like a mean drunk and kind of out of control.
Wes then makes a bizarre statement, evidently intended to prove his innocence.
He said if he would have murdered anyone, it would have been the friend.
Because he didn't kill the drunk friend, there will be no way possible that he could kill Lucky.
Wes Arnold has admitted that he was with Tayanda Lucky Hall the night she was brutally murdered. But he insists she was still alive when he left her apartment.
I was gone a long time before that.
Police are asking Wes questions about Tayanda, and he is telling them, I've had nothing to do with this. I wasn't responsible for this.
But Wes puts forward a bizarre claim to prove his innocence.
Look, if I would have killed anybody that night, it would have been her friend.
He says, you know, because he didn't kill the drunk friend that he had met for the first time, there will be no way possible that he could kill Lucky.
You mean Jocelyn?
Yeah. She really pissed me off, man.
But the detective suspects Wes was actually angry that he got caught stealing from Lucky.
What about Lucky's rainy day fund?
What you mean?
The money she kept in her bedroom.
Knowing my mom, I know when she seen her money was gone, she lost it. I know she did. She knew who to trust and who not to trust. The people that were there with them during this situation, they've been around us for a while now, and my mom knew for a fact that they had nothing to do with her money coming up missing. And she was the type of person that wasn't going to wait. Like, she's going to address the issue.
Where is my money?
I don't know.
According to her friends, Tayanda believed Wes had taken it.
Who else has seen my money?
There will be no other explanation about where this money went.
However, Wes denies taking the money.
Who do you think took it?
I don't know. I don't know who all she had all up in her apartment.
Goodbye.
Wes said that after Tayanda accused him of stealing her money, he took his things and left.
Man, look, I saw what happened on Facebook. I wasn't there. I had nothing to do with that.
It's difficult at times when we're doing interviews and people are adamantly denying it.
Okay, then.
But it isn't difficult for the detective to reach a decision.
Based on the evidence police have, interviews with neighbors, stories from the family, and also the interview from Wes himself, they feel very solid about being able to charge him.
Wes Arnold is charged with first-degree murder.
I was in school and my sister sent me a picture of his mugshot, and I was excited to know that he had finally got caught.
I was relieved because I know some type of closure was gonna come.
But closure will be a long time coming.
While Wes was in custody, the COVID-19 pandemic hit the country. Because of the pandemic, the trial date was pushed back again and again.
The trial finally begins in September of 2023, and Tayanda's family is forced to relive the unimaginable.
I feel like trial was worse than even finding out that my mom had passed, because during trial, we saw explicit photos. It was devastating.
Her daughter definitely got very emotional and very upset and actually had to be removed for a second.
When he came out, he kind of laughed at me. I guess I looked that much like my mom. Everybody says that, but he laughed at me and I lost it. I got put out of the courtroom.
The prosecution claims that the murder stemmed from the dispute over Tayanda's missing cash.
She wasn't the type to not say something about somebody stealing from her.
That was when Wes exploded.
I ain't got your damn money!
We know from Wes's background that he sets off pretty easily. Once he does, he takes it over the top.
He beat her severely enough to dislocate her jaw, cause massive bleeding in her brain, and basically bring her within an inch of her life.
And it only got worse.
He saw there was really no turning back, and so he decided that if I burn this apartment, maybe I will get away with the crime.
Not only did he beat her, he burned her as well.
When he started the fire, he either didn't know or didn't care that she was still alive.
After setting fire to the bedroom where Tayanda was lying unconscious, he turned on the gas stove and left the apartment.
He just was thinking about himself and only himself and trying to get away with a crime. He was willing to blow up a building to make that happen.
During the trial, Wes represents himself and continues his denials.
He continuously lied. He continuously contradicted himself. It was just kind of like he didn't take it seriously.
And as for the fire, he has no real defense.
I've told offenders that you're not gonna get a lot of sympathy when you go to trial with this arson thing.
The jury also doesn't like Wes's attitude in court.
He didn't feel the weight of what he had done. It just was a joke to him. And he just paraded around that courtroom like we were the crazy ones and he was innocent.
It doesn't take the jurors long to reach a verdict.
They find him guilty of first-degree murder and arson with a sentence of life in prison.
To Tayanda's family and friends, the verdict is a cause for celebration.
That was the only thing that could bring us closure, was him being convicted guilty, and he was. So, yeah, we celebrated. We had a party. Yeah, it was good.
He spent the last 15 plus years committing violence. Society at least does not have to worry about Wes Arnold anymore.
But the guilty verdict can't rekindle Tayanda's light.
She definitely left a hole in a lot of people's heart. She was just a big bundle of joy. It's just hard to knock that person and that energy out of your life.
When people stop me and mention my mom, it gives me a sense of joy knowing that she touched so many people I don't even know. I'm happy about that.
Sometimes I wish she wasn't as nice as she was. I wish she wouldn't have helped him, because I would still have my sister. I wish that being the good person that she was didn't cost her life.
On the early morning of April 28th, 1908, the quiet farming community of LaPorte, Indiana, was awakened by an orange glow spreading across the dark horizon. A farmhouse sat engulfed in flames, its roof collapsing into itself as thick columns of smoke climbed into the spring sky. Neighbors rushed toward the property, but the fire had already taken control. There was little anyone could do except watch as the home of one of the town's most recognizable residents disappeared beneath the blaze. The owner of the farm was a Norwegian immigrant named Belle Gunnes, a woman known throughout the area as a hard-working widow who managed nearly 50 acres of farmland with remarkable determination. She was physically imposing, unusually tall for her era, exceptionally strong, and widely respected for her ability to perform labor that many believed only men could handle. Those who knew her saw a woman who had survived personal tragedy, buried 2 husbands, raised children, and maintained a prosperous farm despite unimaginable hardships. From the outside, the burning farmhouse appeared to be the latest cruel chapter in a life already marked by repeated misfortune. As the flames finally subsided, investigators began searching through the smoking remains. What they found initially seemed to confirm the worst. Inside the ruins were the bodies of Belle's 3 children. Nearby lay another body, badly burned and missing its head. Authorities assumed that this was Belle herself. The conclusion appeared straightforward. The fire had claimed 4 lives, ending the life of the widow who had become well known throughout Laporte. Newspapers quickly reported that Belle Gunnes had perished alongside her children. For many, the story might have ended there. A tragic house fire, a grieving community, another terrible loss. Yet almost immediately, small details began to challenge that simple explanation. The unidentified female body discovered inside the ruins did not appear to match the woman everyone believed it belonged to. Those familiar with Belle knew she stood nearly 6 feet tall and weighed somewhere between 120 and 135 kilograms. She possessed an unusually large frame and extraordinary physical strength. The body recovered from the ashes seemed noticeably smaller. Investigators observed that it appeared shorter and significantly lighter than Belle had been known to be. Normally, such differences might have prompted immediate questions, but the absence of the victim's head made positive identification nearly impossible. Without modern forensic science, DNA analysis, or reliable methods of confirming identity through burned remains, officials could not conclusively determine who the victim really was. The assumption that Belle had died rested largely on circumstance rather than certainty. That uncertainty would become one of the greatest mysteries in American criminal history. If the body was not Belle Gunnes, then whose body had been placed inside the farmhouse? And perhaps even more disturbing, where was Belle herself? At the time, however, those questions had not yet become the center of the investigation. The fire itself seemed to demand immediate attention. Authorities examined the burned structure, interviewed neighbors, and attempted to reconstruct the events that had led to the disaster. Suspicion soon fell upon a farmhand named Ray Lamphere, a man who had once worked for Belle and who had reportedly argued with her after being dismissed from the property. His presence around the farm in the weeks leading up to the fire had not gone unnoticed by local residents. To investigators, he appeared to have both motive and opportunity. But while attention focused on the burned farmhouse, another story was quietly unfolding hundreds of miles away. Long before the fire, a Norwegian immigrant named Andrew Helgelian had disappeared after traveling to Indiana. Andrew had sold his property, gathered approximately $900, a considerable fortune in the early 20th century, and journeyed to Laporte after corresponding with Belle Gunnes. According to the letters, the wealthy widow was searching for a husband with financial means, someone willing to share both his future and his assets with her. Belle had encouraged interested men to convert their property into cash before visiting her farm. She also advised them not to discuss their plans with friends or relatives. At first glance, these requests may have seemed practical. If 2 people intended to marry and build a life together, Combining their resources could appear perfectly reasonable. Yet this strategy had another consequence. If a man disappeared after arriving in Indiana, very few people would know where he had gone. There would be no witnesses to his journey, no one waiting at a train station, and often no family expecting regular correspondence. In an era before electronic records, national databases, or rapid communication, such disappearances could remain unsolved indefinitely. Andrew Helgelian never returned home. When his family sought answers, Bell wrote to them, claiming that Andrew had gone to California. The explanation failed to satisfy Andrew's brother. Something about the situation felt wrong. Rather than accepting the letter, he preserved the correspondence and decided to travel to Lawport himself. It was a decision that would change the course of the investigation forever. Unlike many others who accepted simple explanations, Andrew's brother refused to let the disappearance fade into silence. He questioned Bell's account. He compared timelines. He noticed inconsistencies. Most importantly, he remained determined even when there seemed to be little evidence supporting his suspicions. His persistence became the first crack in the carefully maintained image that surrounded Bell. Gunness. At the time, few people imagined that a prosperous farm could conceal anything more sinister than financial disputes or family tragedy. Farms represented hard work, stability, and opportunity. They were places where livestock were raised, crops were harvested, and families built new lives. The thought that such a place might also conceal multiple graves seemed almost unimaginable. Yet as Andrew's brother continued pressing authorities to investigate, attention slowly shifted from the burned house to the land surrounding it. The property stretched across roughly 48 acres, offering countless places where secrets could remain hidden. Bell herself had long been recognized as unusually capable of heavy physical labor. Neighbors had watched her carry feed, slaughter livestock, chop wood, and dig into the earth without assistance. Those observations had once inspired admiration. Soon, investigators would begin viewing them through an entirely different lens. The first excavation did not uncover a complete skeleton lying peacefully beneath the soil. Instead, investigators found human remains concealed inside a sack. It was a discovery so unexpected that it transformed the entire case within moments. The fire that had appeared to be the conclusion of Bell Gunness' story suddenly became only the beginning. As officers continued digging, they realized the first discovery was not an isolated burial. Additional pits would soon reveal more human remains, many of them dismembered and some missing their heads. The quiet farm that neighbors had passed for years without suspicion was about to earn a name that newspapers across America would repeat with horror. The murder farm, what had begun as an investigation into a suspicious fire, was rapidly becoming something far larger, darker, and almost impossible to comprehend. Beneath the fields of an ordinary Indiana farm, investigators were about to uncover evidence suggesting that one woman may have orchestrated one of the most prolific killing operations in American history. Yet even as the graves multiplied, one haunting question refused to disappear. Was Bell Gunness buried beneath the ashes of her farmhouse? Or had she carefully planned her own death, leaving behind another victim while she vanished into history forever? Before Bell Gunness became one of the most infamous names in American true crime history, she was simply Brynhild Paulsdatter Storseth, a girl born far from the cornfields of Indiana and the headlines that would one day immortalize her. She entered the world on November 11th, 1859, in Selbu, a rural community in Norway known for its rugged landscapes, long winters, and farming traditions that demanded relentless physical labor. Brynhild was born into a poor farming family with 8 children, a household where survival depended not on comfort, but on endurance. Every member of the family was expected to contribute, and life offered few luxuries. Days were measured by the changing seasons rather than by opportunity, and children learned from an early age that strength and persistence were essential qualities. While the historical record preserves only limited details about Brynhild's childhood, it is generally understood that she grew up in an environment where hard work was unavoidable. The physical demands of rural Norwegian life shaped countless immigrants who would later cross the Atlantic seeking better futures. And Brynhild was no exception. Decades later, people in Indiana would describe Belle Gunness as astonishingly strong, capable of lifting heavy objects without assistance and performing exhausting farm work that surprised even experienced laborers. Those abilities did not appear overnight. They were almost certainly rooted in the demanding agricultural life she experienced during her youth in Norway. One story has become deeply intertwined with discussions of Brynhild's early life, although historians continue to debate its authenticity. According to the account, when she was around 17 or 18 years old, she attended a community dance while pregnant. During the event, she was allegedly assaulted by a man from a wealthy family who kicked her forcefully in the abdomen. The attack reportedly caused her to lose the pregnancy, while the man responsible escaped punishment because of his family's social standing. Over the years, some writers have suggested that this traumatic event transformed Brynhild's personality, arguing that it marked the beginning of the emotional darkness that later defined Belle Gunness. It is an explanation that has appeared repeatedly in books, documentaries, and popular retellings of the case. However, despite its popularity, no reliable historical evidence conclusively verifies that the incident ever occurred. Contemporary records are either absent or insufficient to establish it as fact. Because of that uncertainty, responsible historians treat the story with caution. It remains part of the folklore surrounding Belle Gunness rather than a confirmed event in her biography. That distinction is important because true crime often exists at the intersection of documented evidence and enduring legend. The temptation to explain extraordinary crimes through dramatic childhood events is powerful. Yet the historical record does not always cooperate. In Belle's case, the truth is that we know far less about her early emotional life than many modern retellings suggest. What is firmly established is that in 1881, Brynhild left Norway and immigrated to the United States. Like many Scandinavians during the late 19th century, she sought opportunity in a country that promised economic advancement unavailable to many rural European families. Thousands of Norwegian immigrants made similar journeys during this period, settling primarily in Midwestern states where farming communities already included large Scandinavian populations. For many newcomers, America represented hope. It offered land, employment, and the possibility of building a future through determination and sacrifice. Brynhild arrived carrying those same ambitions. At some point after reaching America, she adopted the name Belle, a more familiar and easily pronounced name in English-speaking communities. Such changes were common among immigrants attempting to integrate into American society while building new identities. The woman who would eventually become known throughout the country as Belle Gunness began her life in America not as a wealthy landowner, but as a working immigrant trying to establish herself in an unfamiliar nation. Historical records indicate that Belle initially worked as a servant before later finding employment as a factory worker. These jobs reflected the limited opportunities available to immigrant women during that era. Long hours, physically demanding labor, and modest wages defined daily life. Success rarely came quickly, and financial security often depended upon marriage as much as employment. In 1884, Belle married Mads Ditlev Anton Sorensen, another Scandinavian immigrant. To those around them, the marriage appeared entirely ordinary. Like many immigrant couples, they sought stability through hard work and shared ambition. Together, they opened a candy store in Chicago, hoping to establish themselves economically. Nothing in those early years publicly distinguished them from countless other immigrant families. Striving to succeed, they represented a familiar story repeated across American cities during the late 19th century. Newcomers building businesses, adapting to a new culture, and pursuing prosperity through persistence. Yet in hindsight, investigators would eventually revisit these seemingly ordinary years with growing suspicion. During Belle and Mad's marriage, several events occurred that later attracted considerable attention. Their candy store was destroyed by fire. Although devastating, fires were not uncommon in rapidly growing American cities where wooden buildings, open flames, and primitive firefighting methods created constant danger. The couple collected insurance money following the loss. They rebuilt and attempted to continue their lives. Sometime later, their home also burned down. Once again, they received an insurance payout. Standing alone, neither event necessarily suggested criminal behavior. Fires were frequent, and insurance existed precisely because such disasters occurred. At the time, authorities did not accuse Belle or Mads of wrongdoing. Only years later, after investigators uncovered the horrifying discoveries at Belle's Indiana farm, did these earlier incidents begin to appear suspicious. Looking backward through the lens of later events, some investigators questioned whether the fires might have been deliberately set to collect insurance money. Yet no definitive evidence ever established that either fire had been intentionally caused. As with many aspects of the Belle Gunness case, suspicion existed, but certainty remained elusive. During the marriage, Belle also experienced the deaths of two young children, Caroline and Axel. Official records attributed their deaths to acute colitis, a diagnosis frequently used during that period for sudden childhood illnesses that modern medicine might classify differently. Medical knowledge at the turn of the 20th century remained limited, particularly regarding childhood diseases. Infant mortality rates were significantly higher than today, and many deaths occurred without the benefit of sophisticated diagnostic tools or comprehensive autopsies. Following each child's death, Belle received life insurance payments. Once again, nothing about this sequence of events resulted in criminal charges at the time. Insurance policies covering children were not unusual, and illness claimed many young lives during that era. Nevertheless, after Belle became the focus of a murder investigation years later, historians and researchers questioned whether Caroline and Axel might have been among her earliest victims. Despite those suspicions, no forensic evidence exists that proves either child was murdered. Their deaths remain tragic historical events clouded by later discoveries but unsupported by conclusive proof of foul play. The pattern, however, would become difficult to ignore. Fires followed by insurance payments. Family deaths followed by insurance payments. Individually, each event could perhaps be explained as unfortunate coincidence. Collectively, they created a sequence that investigators would later scrutinize with increasing concern. The most striking event occurred on July 30th, 1900, when Mads Sorensen died unexpectedly. According to Belle, her husband had suffered from severe headaches. She stated that he took medication before dying of heart failure. Initially, physicians accepted the explanation, and no criminal investigation followed. Yet one extraordinary detail emerged. Mads died on the precise day when one life insurance policy expired and another took effect. That unusual overlap allowed Belle to receive payments from both policies, maximizing the financial benefit of his death. Years afterward, rumors circulated that one physician suspected poisoning by strychnine rather than natural causes. However, no thorough autopsy capable of confirming such allegations had been performed, and no definitive evidence established poisoning as the cause of death. Once again, certainty proved impossible. What remained beyond dispute was that Belle collected a substantial insurance payout after her husband's death. Armed with that money, she left Chicago behind and relocated to LaPorte, Indiana. There, she purchased approximately 48 acres of farmland, beginning a new chapter in her life. To neighbors, she appeared to be a widow determined to build a prosperous future through hard work. Few could have imagined that the quiet farm she established would eventually become synonymous with one of the most disturbing criminal investigations in American history. Looking back, the move to Indiana marked more than a change of address. It marked the beginning of the period in which Belle Gunness would transform from an obscure immigrant widow into the central figure of a mystery that has endured for more than a century. The questions surrounding her first years in America would never entirely disappear. But it was on that Indiana farm that suspicion would evolve into something far more horrifying, leaving investigators to wonder whether the tragedies of Belle's past had merely foreshadowed the darkness still to come. By the time Belle Gunness settled in Lawport, Indiana, she carried with her a history that, on paper, appeared to be little more than an extraordinary series of personal misfortunes. She had immigrated from Norway with hopes of building a better life. She had worked difficult jobs, married, experienced devastating fires, lost children, and buried her first husband. To neighbors meeting her for the first time, she seemed less like a woman surrounded by suspicion and more like someone who had endured an almost unimaginable amount of hardship. The late 19th and early 20th centuries were unforgiving years. Disease claimed lives with alarming speed, fires frequently destroyed homes and businesses, and farming demanded resilience in the face of constant uncertainty. A widow rebuilding her life after repeated tragedy was not an unusual sight in rural America. In many ways, Belle fit comfortably into that narrative. Yet history would eventually force investigators to revisit each of those earlier tragedies, not as isolated events, but as pieces of a growing pattern. Whether that pattern reflected coincidence or something far more sinister became one of the defining questions of the Belle Gunness case. After receiving the insurance money following the death of Mads Sorensen, Belle purchased approximately 48 acres of farmland outside Lawport. The property represented opportunity. Farming was the backbone of the local economy, and ownership of productive land offered both stability and social respectability. Belle quickly established herself as an industrious landowner. Neighbors observed a woman who seemed almost tireless. She managed livestock, oversaw daily operations, and performed physically demanding work without hesitation. Stories about her strength spread throughout the community. People remarked that she could carry heavy sacks of grain, chop wood for hours, slaughter livestock, and dig into the earth with remarkable endurance. These observations earned admiration rather than suspicion. In rural communities, physical capability was viewed as a virtue. Belle's imposing stature only reinforced her reputation as someone exceptionally suited for the hardships of farm life. Standing nearly 6 feet tall and weighing somewhere between 120 and 135 kilograms, she presented an intimidating figure. Yet many who encountered her described her as polite and practical, someone focused on maintaining her property and providing for her family. There was little reason, at least initially, for neighbors to believe that anything unusual was happening behind the ordinary routines of the farm. 2 years after relocating to Indiana, Belle married again. Her second husband was Peter Gunness, a widower with children of his own. Like Belle, Peter had already experienced profound personal loss. Their marriage appeared to promise companionship and a fresh beginning for two people who had both known grief. But almost immediately after the marriage, tragedy returned. Peter's infant daughter, Myrtle, died only a few months after coming to live with Belle. According to Belle's account, the child suffered convulsions before dying. Infant mortality remained distressingly common during this era, and despite the sadness of the event, authorities found no immediate reason to suspect criminal conduct. The loss was accepted as another heartbreaking example of childhood illness claiming a young life. Once again, the official record left unanswered questions that later investigators would revisit but never conclusively resolve. Before long, another death occurred, one that would attract considerably more attention. On December 13, 1902, Peter Gunness was found dead inside the family home. Belle explained that an unusually heavy cast-iron sausage grinder had fallen from a shelf above, striking Peter on the head and killing him. It was an explanation that immediately generated skepticism. The sausage grinder in question was a substantial piece of equipment. Investigators reportedly found it difficult to imagine how such a heavy object could accidentally fall in precisely the manner described. Some questioned whether the injuries were more consistent with a deliberate blow delivered by a blunt object than with an accidental impact from falling machinery. A physician examining the circumstances reportedly expressed reservations about Bell's version of events. Yet suspicion alone was insufficient to support criminal charges. There were no eyewitnesses. There was no definitive forensic evidence capable of disproving Bell's account. Modern crime scene reconstruction techniques did not exist, and the limitations of early 20th century forensic science left investigators with more questions than answers. Ultimately, Peter Gunnis' death was officially ruled an accident. As had happened after the death of her first husband, Bell received another insurance payment. To later generations, the repeated appearance of insurance benefits following personal tragedies became one of the most discussed aspects of the case. It is important, however, to distinguish between documented facts and retrospective interpretation. The historical record confirms that Bell collected insurance money after multiple losses. It also confirms that investigators, years later, viewed this sequence with increasing suspicion. What it does not provide is conclusive evidence proving that every death preceding the discovery at the farm resulted from murder. The temptation to interpret every tragedy through the lens of later crimes is understandable. But responsible historical analysis requires acknowledging the limits of available evidence. Nevertheless, one undeniable reality emerged after Peter's death. Bell was once again a financially secure widow. She now owned a substantial farm and possessed enough resources to continue expanding her operations. More importantly, she had cultivated an image that inspired confidence rather than fear. She was seen as respectable, hardworking, and self-reliant. In many ways, that public image became one of her greatest assets. Rural communities often relied upon personal reputation more than formal investigation. Neighbors judged character through observation, and Bell appeared to embody the values associated with perseverance and independence. Few imagined that the tragedies surrounding her deserved closer scrutiny. With financial stability established, Bell entered the next phase of her life, one that would ultimately define her place in American criminal history. Rather than relying solely on farming for companionship or economic security, she turned to an entirely different strategy. Across the United States, newspapers serving Norwegian and broader Scandinavian immigrant communities regularly published personal advertisements connecting individuals seeking marriage. These advertisements reflected the realities of immigrant life. Many newcomers lived in isolated farming communities far from extended family and social networks. Newspaper correspondence became one of the few practical ways to meet potential spouses. Bell recognized the opportunity these publications presented. She placed advertisements describing herself as a prosperous widow who owned valuable farmland and wished to find an honest, financially secure husband with whom she could build a future. The wording appeared sincere. There was nothing openly suspicious about a widow searching for companionship after losing her husband. Yet Bell's letters to interested men reportedly contained specific requests that would later become central to the investigation. She encouraged potential suitors to sell their farms, businesses, or other property before traveling to Indiana. She advised them to convert everything into cash, bring the money with them, and avoid discussing their plans with friends or relatives. On the surface, these requests could be interpreted as practical preparations for marriage. Combining financial resources before beginning a new life together might have seemed reasonable. But viewed from another perspective, the strategy accomplished something else entirely. Men who followed Bell's instructions arrived carrying substantial amounts of cash. More importantly, they often traveled alone, leaving behind few people who knew exactly where they were going or when they expected to return. In the early 20th century, Such isolation dramatically complicated any future investigation should they disappear. Without telephones in every home, centralized missing person databases, or rapid interstate communication, adults could vanish with astonishing ease. Families separated by hundreds of miles often depended upon letters that might take days or weeks to arrive. If correspondence suddenly stopped, relatives frequently assumed that work, travel, or changing circumstances explained the silence. By the time genuine concern emerged, valuable weeks or months could already have passed. Investigators later concluded that Bell's instructions effectively reduced the likelihood that anyone would immediately search for the missing man. Whether this strategy was planned from the beginning or evolved over time remains impossible to determine from surviving records. What is certain is that the advertisements attracted numerous responses from Scandinavian immigrants, hoping to find companionship and stability. Among the men who eventually traveled to Bell's farm were individuals whose names would later become permanently associated with the investigation, including Andrew Helgelian, John Moo, Henry Gerhold, Olaf Lindblom, Ole Budsberg, Olaf Svenherud, and several other Norwegian immigrants. Most shared similar characteristics. They were middle-aged, unmarried, financially stable, and eager to establish families after years of hard work. They represented the very people most likely to trust someone who shared their language, cultural background, and immigrant experience. To them, Bell appeared not as a threat but as an opportunity, a fellow Norwegian who had successfully built a prosperous life in America despite enormous personal hardship. That carefully cultivated image concealed whatever truly awaited those who accepted her invitation. As investigators would later attempt to reconstruct the disappearances, they realized that Bell's advertisements were far more than simple marriage notices. They formed the foundation of a system that brought vulnerable men directly to an isolated farm where, one after another, they seemingly vanished without explanation. Whether every disappearance followed the same sequence could never be established with complete certainty. Yet as the list of missing men grew, one disturbing fact became increasingly difficult to ignore. Almost every known trail led to the same destination, the farm of Bell Gunness in LaPorte, Indiana. By the beginning of the 20th century, Bell Gunness had successfully established herself as one of the more prosperous farmers in the LaPorte area. To those living nearby, she was no longer simply an immigrant widow struggling to rebuild her life. She was a landowner with a productive farm, livestock, financial stability, and a reputation for relentless work. Her personal tragedies seemed to belong to the past, and outwardly, she appeared to have overcome them through determination and discipline. Yet behind that respectable image, investigators would later conclude that Bell had begun developing a method unlike anything they had encountered before. It did not rely on chance meetings or random victims. Instead, it depended upon trust, careful planning, and an understanding of human hope. The men who would eventually disappear after arriving at her farm did not come because they were forced. They came because they believed they had finally found the opportunity to begin a new chapter in their lives. One of the most significant tools Bell employed was the newspaper advertisement. At the turn of the 20th century, newspapers were far more than sources of news. They served as essential connections between scattered immigrant communities across the United States. Norwegian and other Scandinavian immigrants often relied upon these publications to exchange information, maintain cultural ties, and even search for marriage partners. For men living alone on isolated farms hundreds of miles apart, such advertisements represented one of the few realistic ways to meet someone who shared their language, traditions, and values. Bell understood that audience well because she belonged to it herself. She placed advertisements presenting herself as a respectable widow who owned valuable farmland and hoped to marry an honest man with financial means. The wording was simple and direct. She described herself as someone seeking companionship rather than charity. emphasizing that she already possessed land and property. This detail was important because it reassured potential suitors that she was not merely searching for someone to support her financially. Instead, she projected the image of two successful adults joining their resources to create an even stronger future together. For many lonely immigrant men, the proposal must have sounded ideal. They saw an opportunity to marry someone who understood their culture while avoiding the uncertainty of starting over with nothing. The letters began arriving. Men from various Scandinavian communities wrote to Belle expressing interest in meeting her. Historical records indicate that Belle often maintained correspondence for extended periods before inviting anyone to visit. This gradual exchange allowed familiarity and confidence to develop. Through carefully written letters, she cultivated trust long before her prospective suitors ever arrived in Indiana. Although the surviving correspondence is incomplete, investigators later determined that Belle consistently encouraged interested men to take several important steps before traveling to her farm. First, she advised them to sell their farms, businesses, or other valuable property. Second, she urged them to convert those assets into cash rather than leave them behind. Third, she instructed them to bring the money with them when they traveled to Indiana. Finally, she recommended that they avoid discussing their plans with relatives, friends, or neighbors. According to the information later gathered during the investigation, Belle suggested that keeping the arrangement private would prevent unnecessary gossip or interference from people who might become jealous of their future happiness. At first glance, these requests could appear practical within the context of marriage. If two people intended to combine their lives, consolidating financial assets might seem entirely reasonable. Likewise, some couples prefer to keep personal matters private until formal engagement or marriage. Nothing in these suggestions automatically implied criminal intent. Yet when investigators examined the disappearances that followed, the significance of Belle's instructions became impossible to ignore. By encouraging men to travel alone with substantial amounts of cash, while telling almost no one where they were going, Belle created circumstances in which their disappearance would be extraordinarily difficult to investigate. In the early 1900s, communication across long distances remained slow and fragmented. There were no electronic financial records documenting every transaction, no nationwide missing person systems, and no immediate way for families to determine exactly where a loved one had traveled. If correspondence suddenly stopped, relatives often assumed that unexpected work, illness, or changing circumstances explained the silence. Weeks or even months might pass before serious concern emerged. By then, valuable evidence could already have disappeared. Investigators later concluded that Belle's instructions effectively isolated her visitors before they even reached Indiana. The farm itself further contributed to that isolation. Situated on approximately 48 acres, the property offered privacy that would have been impossible in a city. Visitors arriving there entered a world largely removed from public observation. Neighbors lived nearby, but daily farm life rarely attracted unusual attention. Travelers coming and going could easily be interpreted as relatives, hired workers, or business associates. Few people had reason to question Belle about the identities of her guests. As investigators attempted to reconstruct events years later, they believed a general pattern had emerged from the disappearances. Although the precise details of each case could never be fully established, the similarities were striking. Men would arrive at Belle's farm after lengthy correspondence. They brought cash obtained from selling their farms or businesses, expecting to begin married life with a woman they believed would become their wife. Belle reportedly welcomed them warmly, reinforcing the trust developed through months of letters. At some point after their arrival, the money they carried came under Belle's control. Supposedly as preparation for marriage or investment in the farm they would soon manage together. What happened next could not always be reconstructed with certainty because so few witnesses survived and the available evidence remained incomplete. Investigators concluded that victims were likely killed either through poisoning or by sudden attacks using blunt instruments such as a hammer or an axe. The historical record does not establish that every victim died by the same method, and responsible accounts distinguish between documented evidence and investigative reconstruction. Nevertheless, authorities believe these methods best fit the physical evidence recovered during later excavations. Once a victim died, investigators believe the body was dismembered. Human remains discovered on the property supported that conclusion. Many skeletons were incomplete. Some bodies were missing their heads, while others had been separated into multiple parts. Such conditions complicated identification enormously. At the beginning of the 20th century, forensic anthropology remained in its infancy. Fingerprint databases were limited, DNA technology did not exist, and dental identification was far less developed than it would become decades later. When investigators uncovered partial skeletons or scattered bones, assigning names to those remains became extraordinarily difficult. Authorities believed that the dismembered remains had been wrapped in sacks before burial at various locations around the property, including beneath the farmyard and near areas where livestock were kept. The existence of pigs on the farm also became a significant consideration during the investigation. The ordinary sights, smells, and activities associated with livestock operations could easily mask other evidence. Nothing about the farm initially appeared inconsistent with normal agricultural life, allowing unusual activity to remain unnoticed. What made the investigation particularly disturbing was not simply the possibility that murders had occurred, but the apparent organization underlying the entire operation. Bell did not appear to have selected victims randomly. Instead, investigators believe she focused on individuals who shared several characteristics. Many were middle-aged Norwegian or Scandinavian immigrants. Most were unmarried. Nearly all possessed savings or property accumulated through years of difficult labor. These were men who had spent much of their lives building financial security while hoping eventually to establish families of their own. Their dreams made them vulnerable to someone offering exactly what they desired most: companionship, stability, and a shared future. Among the individuals later connected to Bell's farm were Andrew Helgelian, John Moo, Henry Gurholt, Olaf Lindlem, Ole Dutsterk, Olaf Svenherud, and several other Scandinavian immigrants. Some disappeared after notifying others that they intended to visit Bell. Others left fewer traces behind. Although investigators eventually associated numerous missing men with the farm, determining exactly how many had visited proved impossible. Records from that period were incomplete, correspondence had been lost, and many disappearances may never have been reported at all. This uncertainty explains why estimates of Bell's total number of victims continue to vary widely. Historians generally agree that at least 14 victims can be identified with reasonable confidence based on available evidence, while other estimates suggest the true number may have reached 20, 30, or even 40 individuals. No definitive figure has ever been established. As the disappearances accumulated, Bell's public reputation remained remarkably intact. To neighbors, she continued to appear as a hard-working widow managing a successful farm. Visitors arrived from time to time, but that alone raised little suspicion. Rural properties frequently hosted laborers, livestock buyers, relatives, or business associates. Without direct evidence of violence, there was little reason for local residents to imagine that the isolated farm concealed anything extraordinary. The greatest strength of Bell's alleged scheme may not have been violence itself, but invisibility. She operated within ordinary social expectations. She corresponded through newspapers, welcomed visitors openly, and managed a respectable farm that blended seamlessly into the surrounding countryside. Nothing about her public life immediately suggested the horrors investigators would eventually uncover. Yet hidden beneath that appearance of normalcy, unanswered questions continued to accumulate with every man who failed to return home. Families waited for letters that never arrived. Friends wondered why correspondence had suddenly ceased. In many cases, the only person who seemed able to explain the disappearances was Belle herself, and her explanations were often accepted without challenge. That acceptance would not last forever. Among the family searching for answers was one man who refused to believe that silence alone explained his brother's disappearance. His determination would ultimately force authorities to look beyond the surface of Belle Gunness' carefully constructed life and begin digging into the ground beneath her farm, where the truth, whatever it ultimately proved to be, had remained hidden for years. Among the many names later connected to Belle Gunness, one would become especially significant, not because his case was necessarily different from the others, but because his disappearance inspired someone to keep asking questions long after others might have given up. That man was Andrew Helgelian, a Norwegian immigrant living in South Dakota. Like many Scandinavian settlers of his generation, Andrew had spent years building a life through persistence and hard work. He represented the kind of person Belle's newspaper advertisements appeared designed to attract. A middle-aged, unmarried man who had accumulated savings and hoped to share the next chapter of his life with someone who understood both his language and his immigrant experience. Belle's letters promised precisely that possibility. She described herself as a prosperous widow with a successful farm in Indiana, someone who did not seek charity, but rather an equal partner willing to help build a future together. Their correspondence continued for some time, gradually establishing trust between two people separated by hundreds of miles. Nothing in the exchange, at least on the surface, suggested danger. Instead, Belle encouraged Andrew to prepare for marriage in the same way she had advised other men. She urged him to sell his property, convert his assets into cash, and travel to Lawport with the money. She also recommended that he keep the journey largely to himself, suggesting that privacy would prevent unnecessary interference from others. In retrospect, investigators would regard these instructions as one of the most revealing aspects of Belle's approach. At the time, however, Andrew appears to have interpreted them as reasonable preparations for beginning a new life. Trust had already been established through their letters, and there was little reason for him to suspect deception. According to the historical record, Andrew sold his property and traveled with approximately $900 in cash, a considerable amount of money in the early 20th century and the equivalent of many tens of thousands of dollars today. It represented years of labor, sacrifice, and careful saving. For Andrew, the money was not merely wealth. It was the foundation of the future he expected to build alongside Belle Gunness. He arrived in Indiana believing he was traveling toward marriage and stability. Instead, he disappeared. Exactly what happened after Andrew reached Belle's farm has never been fully established. There were no surviving eyewitnesses capable of describing his final hours, and investigators later had to reconstruct events from physical evidence and surviving correspondence. Belle maintained that Andrew had simply moved on. When members of his family began asking questions after communication suddenly ceased, Belle wrote to them explaining that Andrew had gone to California. Such a move was not impossible. During this period, Americans frequently relocated in search of employment or new opportunities, and long-distance communication remained unreliable. A family might wait weeks for a letter before becoming concerned. Yet Andrew's relatives found Belle's explanation difficult to accept. One person in particular refused to dismiss the disappearance as an ordinary change of plans. Andrew's brother believed something was wrong. Rather than relying solely on Belle's assurances, he carefully preserved the letters she had written. Those letters, seemingly ordinary pieces of correspondence, would later become important because they documented Belle's communication with Andrew and established that she had invited him to Indiana. More importantly, Andrew's brother made a decision that many others in similar situations might not have made. He chose to travel to Lawport himself. His journey reflected determination rather than certainty. At that point, he could not prove that a crime had occurred. He possessed only unanswered questions, growing suspicion. and an unwillingness to accept a convenient explanation unsupported by evidence. His persistence would ultimately distinguish Andrew's case from many other disappearances that may never have received comparable attention. Upon arriving in Indiana, Andrew's brother sought answers directly. He questioned Belle's account and attempted to learn what had happened after Andrew reached the farm. The historical record preserves only limited details regarding these conversations. But what is clear is that he remained unconvinced by Belle's explanation that Andrew had departed for California. The story failed to resolve the inconsistencies that troubled him. If Andrew had truly begun a new life elsewhere, why had he stopped communicating with family altogether? Why had no convincing evidence emerged confirming his supposed relocation? Why did Belle appear to be the only person capable of describing his departure? These questions gradually accumulated without satisfactory answers. Instead of abandoning the search, Andrew's brother turned to local authorities. Convincing law enforcement to investigate a missing adult in the early 20th century was far more difficult than it would be today. Adults possessed the legal freedom to travel wherever they wished, often without notifying anyone. Records documenting movement between states were limited, and prolonged absences were not automatically viewed as evidence of criminal conduct. Nevertheless, Andrew's brother continued pressing his concerns, emphasizing both Belle's correspondence and the unexplained disappearance that followed Andrew's visit. His persistence slowly began attracting attention. By itself, Andrew's disappearance might still have remained unresolved. But once authorities started examining Belle's history more closely, broader patterns began emerging. They learned that Andrew was not the only man who had traveled to Belle's farm after responding to newspaper advertisements. Other Scandinavian immigrants had also vanished after corresponding with the wealthy widow from Indiana. Individually, each disappearance could perhaps be explained away. Together, they suggested something deeply troubling. Investigators realized they were no longer dealing with a single missing person, but potentially with a series of disappearances connected by one common destination. The growing suspicion prompted authorities to shift their attention toward Belle's property. At first, there was no expectation that they would uncover one of the most disturbing crime scenes in American history. The farm looked much like countless others scattered across rural Indiana. Livestock moved through fenced fields. Agricultural equipment rested where it belonged. Daily routines appeared ordinary. Nothing immediately visible hinted at extraordinary violence. Yet investigators recognized that if Andrew had indeed disappeared after arriving there, the property itself might contain evidence capable of answering the questions that correspondence alone could not. Their decision to examine the land more closely marked a turning point in the investigation. The farmhouse had already drawn attention because of the devastating fire that claimed the lives of Belle's 3 children and left behind the headless female body believed to be Belle herself. Now, however, the focus expanded beyond the burned structure to the surrounding acreage. 48 acres offered countless places where evidence could remain hidden for years, particularly on an active farm where digging, planting, livestock management, and changing seasons constantly altered the landscape. Investigators began searching carefully. The first major discovery did not resemble anything expected during a routine missing person investigation. Instead of finding personal belongings or simple clues indicating Andrew's whereabouts, authorities uncovered human remains concealed within a sack buried on the property. The discovery immediately transformed the investigation. One hidden body might have suggested an isolated homicide, but investigators quickly realized the situation was far more extensive. As additional areas were examined, more burial sites began to emerge. The land concealed not one victim, but multiple sets of human remains. Some were incomplete. Others had been dismembered. Several lacked their heads entirely, making identification extraordinarily difficult. Every new excavation deepened the sense that investigators had stumbled upon something almost unimaginable. The farm itself was gradually revealing a history that no one had suspected while Belle lived there. As a respected widow, identifying the victims presented enormous challenges. At the beginning of the 20th century, forensic science remained limited. DNA analysis would not exist for decades. Fingerprint comparison had only begun developing as an investigative tool, and skeletal identification techniques were far less advanced than modern standards. Many remains had deteriorated after years underground, while dismemberment further complicated efforts to determine identity. Investigators relied upon clothing, personal effects, available records, and circumstantial evidence whenever possible, but certainty often remained beyond reach. Despite these limitations, authorities eventually associated several missing men with the remains recovered from the property, including Andrew Helgelian and other Scandinavian immigrants who had disappeared after visiting Belle. The excavation continued over multiple days, and with every new discovery, public interest intensified. Newspapers reported the astonishing developments, describing investigators uncovering grave after grave beneath what had once appeared to be an ordinary farm. The property soon became known throughout the country by a chilling new name, the Murder Farm. That phrase captured both the horror of the discoveries and the growing realization that the investigation had expanded far beyond the disappearance of a single man. What Andrew's brother had begun as a personal search for answers was now exposing one of the most significant criminal investigations of its era. Yet even as investigators uncovered more human remains, one central mystery remained unresolved. If Belle Gunness had truly died in the fire, then the case centered upon identifying her victims and understanding the full scope of her crimes. But if the headless body discovered in the ashes belonged to someone else, then the woman authorities believed responsible for the killings might still be alive. The discoveries beneath the farm answered some questions while creating an even larger one. Had investigators uncovered the burial ground of a dead serial killer, or had they merely arrived too late to prevent her escape? Once investigators accepted that the disappearance of Andrew Helgelian could not be dismissed as an isolated case, the search of Belle Gunness' property became increasingly methodical. What had begun as an effort to locate evidence connected to one missing man gradually transformed into a large-scale excavation unlike anything local authorities had experienced before. The 48-acre farm outside Lawport had long appeared ordinary. It was a place where crops were grown, livestock were raised, and daily life followed the familiar rhythm of rural Indiana. But as officers and workers began turning over the soil, the land started revealing a far different history. The first discovery shocked everyone involved. Buried beneath the ground was a sack containing human remains, even before investigators could determine the identity of the victim. The significance of the find was unmistakable. Human remains concealed in such a manner could not easily be explained as an accident or a natural burial. The discovery immediately justified expanding the search, rather than ending the investigation. The first grave became the beginning of a much larger excavation. Authorities continued digging across different sections of the property. As they searched further, additional burial sites emerged. What initially appeared to be a single hidden body soon became multiple graves scattered around the farm. With each new excavation, investigators uncovered more bones, more human remains, and more evidence suggesting that several people had been buried on the property over an extended period. The discoveries were not confined to one isolated corner of the farm. Instead, remains were recovered from various locations, reinforcing the growing belief that the land itself had been repeatedly used to conceal the dead. The condition of the remains made the investigation especially disturbing. Many bodies had not been buried intact. Investigators found evidence indicating that numerous victims had been dismembered before burial. Some skeletons were incomplete, while others were missing major portions of their bodies. Several remains lacked heads entirely. In other cases, body parts appeared separated and buried apart from one another. This condition created enormous difficulties for identification. At the beginning of the 20th century, forensic science offered investigators only limited tools. DNA testing did not exist. Modern forensic anthropology had not yet developed into the discipline known today. Even fingerprint identification, though becoming more widely used, offered little assistance when investigators recovered only skeletal remains. As a result, identifying victims often depended upon clothing fragments, personal possessions, correspondence, or circumstantial evidence rather than scientific certainty. The fragmented condition of many remains made that process extraordinarily difficult. Investigators could rarely examine complete bodies. Instead, they faced scattered bones that had spent months or years beneath the soil. Time, weather, and decomposition had erased much of the evidence that modern investigators might rely upon. Every recovered bone raised new questions while offering only partial answers. Some victims could eventually be associated with known missing persons, but many others remained impossible to identify conclusively. The investigation, therefore, became not only a search for evidence against Belle Gunness, but also an effort to restore identities to individuals whose lives had effectively disappeared from public record. Authorities believed that the condition of the remains reflected deliberate attempts to conceal both the deaths and the identities of the victims. Dismemberment significantly complicated identification, especially in an era lacking sophisticated forensic techniques. Investigators concluded that separating bodies into smaller parts would also have made burial easier. Rather than requiring a single large grave, remains could be placed in sacks and hidden in smaller pits throughout the property. The arrangement of the graves suggested repeated activity rather than a single event. Nothing indicated that all the burials had occurred at the same time. Instead, investigators believed the property had gradually accumulated victims over several years. This conclusion aligned with the growing list of men who had disappeared after corresponding with Belle through newspaper advertisements. As names were compared against letters, travel histories, and reports from concerned relatives, patterns became increasingly difficult to ignore. Andrew Helgelian was not alone. Som må Henrygoholdet, Olaf Lindum, Ole Dutsterk, Olaf Svenherod, and several other Scandinavian immigrants had also vanished after traveling to Belle's farm. Many shared remarkably similar circumstances. They had sold property, converted assets into cash, journeyed alone to Indiana, and then disappeared without reliable explanation. Their stories differed in personal details, yet each pointed investigators toward the same destination. Belle's correspondence with these men became especially important because it established direct connections between the victims and the farm. Although surviving letters could not explain exactly what happened after the men arrived, they demonstrated that Belle had actively encouraged them to visit. Combined with the growing number of human remains recovered from the property, those letters helped investigators reconstruct what they believed had occurred. According to their reconstruction, visitors arrived expecting marriage or business opportunities, entrusted Belle with their money, and were never seen again. The precise method of killing could not always be established for every victim. Based on available evidence, investigators believe that Belle may have used either poison or sudden attacks with blunt instruments such as a hammer or an axe. The condition of many remains prevented definitive conclusions in every case, but the pattern suggested deliberate homicide rather than accidental death. Once victims died, investigators believed their bodies were dismembered before burial in various locations around the farm. Although individual cases differed, this general reconstruction fit the evidence recovered during the excavation. One aspect of the farm itself may also have contributed to the concealment of the crimes. Belle raised livestock, including pigs, as part of her normal agricultural operations. Farms naturally contained disturbed soil, frequent digging, and strong odors associated with animals and agricultural work. Such conditions could easily disguise activities that might otherwise attract attention in a more populated setting. Neighbors observing Belle working with livestock or digging on her property would have had little reason to suspect criminal conduct. The ordinary routines of farming created an environment in which repeated burials could remain unnoticed for years. As excavation continued, public interest grew rapidly. Newspapers across the country reported each new discovery with increasing astonishment. Every additional set of remains intensified the sense that investigators had uncovered one of the largest murder investigations in American history. Reporters struggled to describe the horrifying discoveries. And before long, the property acquired a name that would remain permanently associated with Belle Gunness. The murder farm. The phrase captured public imagination because it transformed an ordinary agricultural property into a symbol of concealed violence. What had once appeared to be a respectable family farm now represented hidden graves, missing travelers, and unanswered questions stretching across several states. The discoveries also forced investigators to reconsider Belle herself. Before the excavation, many residents remembered her primarily as a hard-working widow who had survived repeated personal tragedies. After the graves were uncovered, that image collapsed almost overnight. Authorities began examining her earlier life through an entirely different perspective. The deaths of her husbands, the insurance payments, the newspaper advertisements, and the disappearances of numerous Scandinavian immigrants no longer appeared as unrelated events. Instead, investigators increasingly viewed them as components of a broader pattern. Yet despite the mounting evidence recovered from the farm, one extraordinary uncertainty continued to overshadow the entire investigation. The headless female body found inside the burned farmhouse had been assumed to belong to Belle Gunness. However, investigators had already noticed that the remains appeared significantly smaller than Belle herself. Without the victim's head, positive identification remained impossible. This uncertainty profoundly affected every aspect of the case. If Belle had died in the fire, then the investigation centered upon documenting her crimes and identifying as many victims as possible. But if the body belonged to another woman, then Belle might have escaped before authorities ever began uncovering the graves. The excavation therefore produced two parallel investigations. One focused on identifying the dead buried throughout the property. The other sought to answer an even more unsettling question. Where was Belle Gunness? That uncertainty became even more significant as attention shifted toward a man who had been closely connected to Belle during the final months before the fire. His name was Ray Lamphere, a former farmhand whose relationship with Belle, dismissal from the property, and subsequent arrest would place him at the center of the next chapter of the investigation. Whether he was simply a disgruntled employee, a witness who knew too much, or someone who possessed knowledge of Belle's ultimate fate, would become one of the most fiercely debated questions surrounding the murder farm. As investigators continued uncovering human remains across the Gunness farm, public attention increasingly shifted toward another figure whose name had surfaced almost immediately after the devastating fire of April 28, 1908. His name was Ray Lamphere, a farm laborer who had once worked for Belle Gunness and who, according to accounts gathered during the investigation, had developed a close relationship with her before eventually being dismissed from the property. Long before the excavation revealed hidden graves beneath the farm, Ray had already become a person of interest because of the circumstances surrounding the fire itself. The destruction of Belle's farmhouse had initially appeared to be a tragic accident. But once questions emerged about the identity of the headless body recovered from the ruins, investigators began examining everyone who might have possessed knowledge of Belle's final days. Ray quickly became the obvious starting point. Historical records established that Ray Lamphere had worked on Belle's farm and that the relationship between the two eventually deteriorated. After Belle dismissed him, witnesses reported seeing Ray return to the property on multiple occasions. According to neighbors, arguments and confrontations had occurred between the former employee and the farm owner. These incidents became especially important after the fire because they appeared to provide investigators with both motive and opportunity. If Ray harbored resentment following his dismissal, authorities reasoned that he might have sought revenge by setting fire to the farmhouse. At that early stage of the investigation, however, the hidden graves had not yet been fully uncovered. Law enforcement initially approached the case primarily as a suspicious fire that had apparently claimed the lives of Belle Gunness and her 3 children. Under those circumstances, Ray's previous conflicts with Belle seemed highly significant. As a result, authorities arrested him. The arrest reflected what investigators knew at the time rather than what later discoveries would reveal. They suspected that Ray might have been responsible not only for the fire, but also for Belle's apparent death. Yet as the excavation of the property progressed, and additional human remains emerged from beneath the soil, the entire context of the investigation changed. Suddenly, the central question was no longer limited to who had burned the farmhouse. Investigators now faced the possibility that the farm itself had served as the burial site for numerous victims over several years. This new reality complicated Ray Lamphere's role considerably. If Belle had indeed been responsible for the deaths uncovered on her property, then understanding Ray's relationship with her became even more important. Was he merely an employee unaware of what had occurred? Had he discovered something he was never supposed to know? Or had he participated in some aspect of Belle's activities? The available evidence has never provided definitive answers to those questions. What is firmly documented is that Ray was prosecuted for arson. Authorities argued that he had deliberately set the farmhouse ablaze. After considering the evidence presented, the court convicted him of that offense. However, the prosecution failed to establish beyond reasonable doubt that Ray had murdered Belle Gunness. Consequently, he was acquitted of homicide. That distinction remains important. The legal system concluded that sufficient evidence existed to convict him of setting the fire, but not of killing Belle. Even after the trial, uncertainty continued surrounding the events of that April morning. If Belle truly died in the fire, Ray's conviction for arson explained how the blaze may have begun, but it did not explain the murders discovered beneath the farm. Conversely, if Belle had escaped before the fire, Ray's role became even more complicated. Did he unknowingly assist her escape? Did he intentionally help her disappear? Or was he simply connected to the fire while remaining ignorant of Belle's broader plans? The historical record does not answer those questions with certainty. Much of the continuing debate stems from statements Ray reportedly made later regarding Belle's intentions. According to accounts that circulated after the investigation, Ray claimed that Belle had planned her disappearance in advance. He reportedly stated that she intended to fake her own death and leave Indiana after withdrawing most of her money from the bank. If true, such a plan would explain several of the most puzzling aspects of the case. It could account for the presence of a headless female body that did not appear to match Belle's physical characteristics. It might also explain why the body found in the ruins seemed considerably smaller than the woman everyone believed it to be. Furthermore, investigators had already become aware that Belle had withdrawn nearly all of her available funds before the fire occurred. Taken together, these details formed the foundation of one of the most enduring theories in American criminal history. Yet there is an important limitation that cannot be overlooked. Ray Lamphere's reported statements were never fully verified. Historians continue to note that while his account has influenced countless discussions of the case, it cannot be accepted as conclusive evidence. No independent documentation confirms every aspect of what Ray allegedly claimed. As a result, his statements remain part of the historical debate rather than established fact. This uncertainty reflects a broader characteristic of the Belle Gunness investigation. Many elements of the case rest upon circumstantial evidence, incomplete records, and competing interpretations rather than definitive proof. The destruction of the farmhouse eliminated valuable evidence. The absence of modern forensic science prevented investigators from answering questions that today might be resolved through DNA testing or advanced crime scene analysis. Missing documents, deteriorated remains, and the passage of time have only deepened those uncertainties. Consequently, Ray Lamphere occupies a uniquely ambiguous position within the story. He was unquestionably connected to Bell. He unquestionably faced trial for setting the fire. Beyond those established facts, however, much of his role remains uncertain. Some observers have viewed him as a jealous former employee whose resentment culminated in arson. Others have suggested he may have known far more about Bell's activities than he ever revealed publicly. Still others have argued that he became a convenient suspect whose visible conflicts with Bell overshadowed the possibility that she herself orchestrated the final chapter of the case. None of these interpretations has been conclusively proven. As investigators continued reviewing evidence recovered from the farm, they also examined the circumstances surrounding the unidentified female body found in the burned house. Several details continued troubling authorities. Bell had been exceptionally large and physically powerful. Witnesses consistently described her as standing nearly 6 feet tall with a substantial build. By contrast, the body recovered after the fire appeared noticeably shorter and lighter. Under ordinary circumstances, such differences would have demanded careful investigation. Unfortunately, the absence of the victim's head made positive identification extraordinarily difficult. Without modern DNA analysis, investigators lacked the means to establish identity conclusively. This single missing body part transformed what might otherwise have been a straightforward death. Investigation into one of the greatest unresolved mysteries in American criminal history. If the body truly belonged to Bell, then her crimes ended with the fire. If it belonged to someone else, then the possibility remained that Bell had engineered her own disappearance while authorities focused on the burning farmhouse. The withdrawal of nearly all her money before the fire added further complexity. Financial records indicated that Bell had removed most of her available funds shortly before the destruction of the property. Standing alone, such a withdrawal might not necessarily suggest criminal intent. Farmers frequently required cash for land purchases, equipment, livestock, or other expenses. However, when viewed alongside the uncertain identity of the body discovered after the fire, the withdrawal became difficult to ignore. Investigators recognized that if Bell had planned to leave Indiana permanently, access to cash would have been essential. This realization gave additional weight to the theory that she may have escaped. Even so, no verified evidence ever established where she supposedly went. No confirmed sightings placed her in another state. No authenticated documents demonstrated that she assumed a new identity. Rumors spread rapidly, as they often do in notorious criminal cases. But rumor alone could not resolve the investigation. Thus, the case reached a remarkable point. Investigators had uncovered multiple human remains buried across Bell's property. They had linked numerous missing Scandinavian immigrants to her newspaper advertisements and correspondence. They had arrested and convicted Ray Lamphere for arson while acquitting him of murder. Yet despite these significant developments, they still could not answer the simplest question of all: was Bell Gunness dead or alive? That uncertainty ultimately gave rise to 3 competing explanations that continue to define discussion of the case more than a century later. According to the official conclusion reached at the time, Bell died in the farmhouse fire. According to another theory, she carefully staged her own death, escaped Indiana, and disappeared forever. A third possibility suggested that she survived under an entirely new identity somewhere else in the United States. The evidence supporting each theory remained incomplete, ensuring that the mystery would endure long after the investigation itself had ended. The investigation into Bell Gunness became one of the most complicated criminal cases of its time, because it involved not only a series of suspected murders, but also a disappearance that challenged investigators' understanding of what had actually happened. The discoveries at the farm had created overwhelming public attention. Newspapers across the United States reported the shocking findings from Lockport, Indiana, describing the recovery of human remains from the property and the growing belief that the quiet widow who had lived there might have been responsible for multiple deaths. However, while public opinion quickly turned against Belle Gunness, the legal process faced a far more difficult challenge. The evidence was extensive, disturbing, and emotionally powerful, but much of it remained circumstantial. The central figure accused of orchestrating the crimes was no longer available to stand trial. Belle's possible death or escape meant that prosecutors could not present a case against her in court. Instead, authorities had to focus on the people still connected to the events, particularly Ray Lamphere, whose relationship with Belle and involvement in the fire placed him under intense scrutiny. From the beginning, the case against Ray was shaped by the circumstances surrounding the destruction of the farmhouse. Investigators believed the fire had not been accidental. The timing of the blaze, Ray's history with Belle, and reports of conflicts between them all contributed to suspicion. Authorities argued that Ray had a reason to harm Belle after losing his position on the farm and after their relationship had deteriorated. In a case filled with uncertainty, these personal connections became some of the strongest available evidence. Yet the prosecution faced a difficult problem. While suspicion surrounded Ray, proving exactly what he had done required more than a motive. Investigators needed evidence that could establish his direct responsibility for the deaths. Connected to the farm, the discovery of the graves complicated the situation rather than simplifying it. The more authorities learned about the hidden remains, the clearer it became that the crimes, if committed by Belle, had occurred over a much longer period and involved many victims. The fire was only one event in a much larger story. During the trial, prosecutors presented evidence related primarily to the arson charge. They argued that Ray had deliberately started the fire that destroyed Belle's home. The circumstances surrounding the blaze supported their argument, particularly his known disputes with Belle before the incident. The prosecution portrayed Ray as a disgruntled former employee whose anger had escalated into violence. However, when it came to the accusation that he had murdered Belle Gunness, the evidence was far weaker. The identity of the headless body recovered from the ruins remained uncertain. Without a confirmed identification, prosecutors could not prove that Belle had even died in the fire, much less that Ray had killed her. The missing head became one of the most significant obstacles in the entire investigation. In a modern case, DNA analysis might have provided answers within days or weeks. Investigators could have compared remains with relatives, confirmed identity, or determined whether the body belonged to Belle or another woman. In 1908, however, such technology did not exist. Authorities were forced to rely on physical observations, witness descriptions, and limited medical examination. Those methods were insufficient to remove all doubt. The body was believed by many to be Belle's because it was discovered inside her home and alongside the remains of her children. Yet several details caused hesitation. The body appeared smaller than Belle's known size, and without the head, absolute confirmation was impossible. These uncertainties followed the case throughout the trial and beyond. The courtroom proceedings also reflected a broader problem that affected many early 20th century criminal investigations: the difference between public certainty and legal certainty. To many observers, the discoveries at the farm seemed to prove that Belle was a murderer. The image of human remains buried throughout her property created a powerful emotional reaction. Newspapers described the horrors of the so-called murder farm, and the public quickly accepted the idea that Belle had committed numerous crimes. But a courtroom required specific evidence connected to specific charges. Suspicion, no matter how strong, could not replace proof. This distinction explains why some questions remained unresolved even after the investigation. Attracted national attention. Ray Lamphere was ultimately convicted of arson, but was not convicted of murdering Belle Gunness. The verdict reflected the limited evidence available. The court accepted that he had played a role in the destruction of the farmhouse, but it could not establish that he was responsible for Belle's death. This outcome left many questions unanswered. If Ray did not kill Belle, then what happened to her? If Belle died in the fire, why did the body create so many doubts? If she escaped, how had she managed to disappear completely? The uncertainty surrounding Belle's fate became as famous as the murders themselves. After the trial, attention remained focused on identifying the victims buried at the farm. Investigators continued examining the evidence, attempting to connect recovered remains with the men who had disappeared after responding to Belle's advertisements. Some victims were identified through personal information, letters, and circumstances surrounding their last known movements. Others remained unknown. The incomplete nature of the remains made the process extremely challenging. Many families who suspected their relatives had disappeared into Belle's world never received complete answers. For them, the investigation provided some explanation, but rarely true closure. The estimated number of Belle's victims remained one of the most debated aspects of the case. Investigators could confirm several victims with evidence strong enough to establish a connection to the farm. At least 14 victims are generally accepted by historians as having been identified or strongly linked to Belle. However, the true number may have been far higher. Some researchers believe that 20, 30, or even 40 people may have lost their lives. The difficulty in determining the exact number resulted from several factors: missing records, unidentified remains, and the possibility that many disappearances were never reported. Many of Belle's suspected victims were immigrants living far from close family networks. Their disappearances could occur without immediate investigation. In an era before modern communication systems, a person could vanish and leave behind only unanswered letters and uncertain memories. The case also raised disturbing questions about how Belle was able to continue for so long without detection. The answer appears connected to the social environment of the time. Belle operated within familiar expectations. She was a widow, a property owner, and a member of an immigrant community. She communicated through newspapers, an accepted method of meeting potential spouses. She managed a farm, performed hard physical labor, and appeared independent. None of these behaviors alone suggested criminality. Her alleged crimes remained hidden because they were concealed behind ordinary activities. She used trust rather than force to bring victims to her. The men who traveled to her farm believed they were making decisions that would improve their lives. They were not strangers wandering into danger. They were individuals responding to the promise of companionship and a shared future. This aspect of the case remains one of its most tragic elements. The victims were not simply names in an investigation file. They were people who had families, histories, and dreams. Many had spent years working to build savings, only to lose everything when they trusted someone who appeared to offer them hope. The discovery of their remains transformed them from missing individuals into recognized victims. But for many families, the full truth of what happened remained incomplete. More than a century later, the legal outcome of the Belle Gunness case remains unusual. There was no final courtroom confrontation with the accused. There was no definitive confession. There was no complete list of victims. There was no certain answer regarding Belle's fate. Instead, the case ended with fragments, graves beneath a farm, a convicted accomplice, a destroyed house, and a woman whose identity remained uncertain after her disappearance. Yet those fragments were enough to secure Belle Gunness' place among the most infamous figures in American criminal history. The investigation demonstrated both the strengths and limitations of early law enforcement. Authorities successfully uncovered a hidden graveyard and connected multiple disappearances to one location. But they could not overcome the absence of modern forensic tools or the disappearance of the person. At the center of the investigation, the unanswered questions ensured that the story would continue long after the trial ended. Was Belle Gunness truly buried among the ruins of her farmhouse? Or did she escape and create a new life somewhere beyond Indiana? That question would continue haunting investigators, historians, and the public for generations. The mystery of Belle Gunness was not simply about the crimes discovered on the farm. It was also about the possibility that the person responsible may have walked away from everything she had done, leaving behind only rumors, evidence, and an enduring shadow. The discovery of the graves beneath the Gunness farm answered one question while creating another that would never fully disappear. Authorities had uncovered evidence of multiple deaths, identified a pattern connecting missing men to Belle's property, and revealed a disturbing story of deception and suspected murder. Yet the person at the center of the investigation remained an unanswered mystery. The most important question was not only what Belle Gunness had done, but what happened to Belle Gunness herself. Had she died inside the burning farmhouse on the morning of April 28, 1908? Or had she carefully planned her disappearance and escaped before investigators arrived? More than a century later, that question remains one of the most fascinating unresolved mysteries in American criminal history. The official conclusion reached by authorities at the time was that Belle had died in the fire. The evidence appeared straightforward at first. The farmhouse burned completely, and among the ruins investigators found the remains of a woman alongside the bodies of Belle's 3 children. Since the body was discovered inside Belle's home, and the children were believed to be hers, many naturally assumed the adult female remains belonged to Belle. This explanation provided a simple ending to an otherwise extraordinary investigation. The suspected killer had died, the victims had been discovered, and the case could move toward closure. However, almost immediately, doubts began to emerge. The greatest problem was the condition of the body itself. The remains were missing the head, making identification impossible through normal methods. Without the face, investigators could not confirm that the person was Belle. Physical comparisons also raised concerns. Belle Gunness was known as an unusually large woman, standing approximately 1.83 meters tall and weighing well over 100 kilograms. Witnesses who knew her described her powerful build and remarkable physical presence. The body recovered after the fire appeared smaller and lighter than Belle's known appearance. These differences did not prove that the body was not hers, but they created enough uncertainty to prevent absolute confidence. The missing head transformed a presumed identification into a permanent question. Another detail that fueled suspicion was Belle's financial activity before the fire. Investigators discovered that she had withdrawn much of her money from the bank shortly before the farmhouse burned. A financial withdrawal alone was not proof of a planned escape. Farmers often needed cash for practical reasons, and Belle's property required constant expenses. However, when combined with the uncertain identity of the body and the discovery of multiple graves, the withdrawal became one of the strongest arguments supporting the escape theory. If Belle had intended to disappear, access to money would have been essential. Investigators also considered the timing of the fire itself. The destruction of the farmhouse eliminated the physical location where Belle lived and removed many potential pieces of evidence. If someone wanted to erase traces of a criminal operation, a fire would accomplish exactly that. Important documents, personal belongings, and other records could be destroyed. Whether the fire was part of Belle's own plan or the result of another person's actions became a matter of intense debate. The possibility that Belle staged her death gained further attention after statements attributed to Ray Lamphere. According to later accounts, Ray claimed that Belle had already planned to disappear. He allegedly stated that she intended to fake her death and leave Indiana after withdrawing her money. If accurate, this explanation would solve several mysteries at once. It would explain why the body in the ruins appeared inconsistent with Belle's known physical characteristics. It would explain why Belle had secured access to cash before the fire. It would explain why investigators never found a clear answer regarding her final moments. However, Ray's statements must be viewed cautiously. His credibility was complicated by his own involvement in the case. He had been convicted of arson and had a personal connection to Belle. His claims about her escape were never independently verified. Although they remain an important part of the historical discussion, they cannot be considered definitive proof. The possibility that Belle survived the fire created a second mystery. Where could she have gone? If she escaped, she managed something extraordinarily difficult. Belle was not an unknown person. By 1908, her name had become nationally recognized. Newspapers across the country reported the discoveries at the farm. Anyone familiar with the case would have recognized her description. She was also physically distinctive. Her height, size, and appearance would have made complete anonymity challenging. Yet despite widespread attention, no confirmed evidence ever established her location after the fire. Over the years, numerous rumors emerged. Some stories suggested that Belle had been seen in different parts of the United States. Others claimed she lived under another identity. Some theories placed her in California or other distant locations. These stories contributed to the legends surrounding her, but none produced reliable evidence. No authenticated records, confirmed photographs, or verified documents proved that Belle continued living after 1908. The lack of evidence allowed speculation to continue. The idea of a notorious murderer escaping justice captured public imagination because it created an ending. Unlike most criminal cases, many investigations conclude with an arrest, trial, and sentence. The Belle Gunness case ended with uncertainty. There was no confirmed death, no confession, and no final explanation. The absence of an ending became part of the story itself. However, historians have also emphasized the importance of separating fact from legend. Over time, dramatic retellings of the case sometimes presented theories as though they were established truths. The reality is more complicated. Some facts are well documented. Belle existed, she owned the farm. Multiple human remains were discovered on her property. Several missing men were connected to her through correspondence, and Ray Lamphere was convicted of arson. Other elements remain uncertain: the exact number of victims, the full method of each killing, and whether Belle survived the fire. Responsible examination of the case requires acknowledging both what is known and what remains unknown. One of the most significant consequences of Belle's possible escape was the emotional impact on the victims' families. If Belle truly died in the fire, families could at least believe that the person responsible had faced a form of justice. But if she escaped, then the possibility remained that someone who had destroyed their loved ones' lives continued living freely. For relatives seeking answers, uncertainty added another layer of pain. The investigation revealed what likely happened to many missing men, but it could never provide complete justice or complete truth. The victims themselves remained the most important part of the story. Their names: Andrew Helgelian, John Moo, Henry Gerhold, Olaf Lindblom, Ole Budsberg, Olaf Svenherud, and others, represent real individuals whose lives ended under circumstances that may never be fully understood. They were not simply evidence in a criminal investigation. They were people who worked, saved money, formed relationships, and hoped for a better future. Their trust was allegedly exploited by someone who presented herself as a person seeking the same things they wanted: security, companionship, and a new beginning. The mystery surrounding Belle's fate sometimes overshadowed the suffering of those victims. The question of whether she escaped is undeniably fascinating, but it is not the only story that matters. The tragedy of the case lies first in the lives lost and the families left searching for answers. The farm in Lawport became a symbol of hidden violence, but beneath that symbol were individual human stories. As years passed, efforts continued to examine the remains and reconsider the evidence. Advances in forensic science created new possibilities, including attempts to use modern methods to determine whether the remains believed to belong to Belle actually matched her identity. However, even these efforts did not produce a final answer that ended the debate. The uncertainty remained. Belle Gunness existed somewhere between history and mystery. She was a documented person whose crimes were connected to real evidence. Yet the final chapter of her life remained unwritten. This unresolved ending ensured that her name continued to appear in discussions of infamous criminals. The combination of suspected murders, financial deception, a hidden graveyard, and a possible escape created a case unlike almost any other. The story was not only about how many people may have died on the farm. It was also about the possibility that the person responsible had successfully erased herself from history. Whether Belle Gunness died in the flames or disappeared into another life, the impact of the investigation was undeniable. The discovery of the murder farm exposed one of the darkest criminal cases of its era and demonstrated how easily trust could be manipulated. It also revealed the limitations faced by investigators working without modern forensic technology. More than 100 years later, the question remains unchanged. Was the body recovered from the burned farmhouse truly Belle Gunness? Or did she walk away from the destruction and leave behind only a mystery? The answer may never be known, and that uncertainty is what continues to make the case of Belle Gunness one of the most haunting chapters in American true crime history. More than a century has passed since the name Belle Gunness became associated with one of the most disturbing criminal investigations in American history. The discovery of human remains beneath her Indiana farm transformed a quiet rural property into a place remembered as the murder farm, a symbol of hidden violence concealed behind the appearance of ordinary life. Yet even after the investigation, the trial of Ray Lamphere, and decades of historical examination, the full truth of the case remains incomplete. The exact number of victims is unknown. The complete details of every crime cannot be reconstructed. And perhaps the greatest mystery of all, the final fate of Belle Gunness, remains unanswered. The story of Belle Gunness endures not simply because of the crimes attributed to her, but because the case represents a combination of deception, vulnerability, and uncertainty. It reveals how a person could use ordinary social expectations to create an environment where terrible acts could remain hidden for years. Belle did not appear as a dangerous figure to the outside world. She was a widow, a property owner, an immigrant who had built a successful farm, and a woman who appeared determined to survive after personal tragedy. The image she created allowed her to exist within her community without immediate suspicion. This contrast between appearance and reality became one of the defining characteristics of the investigation. Before the discoveries at the farm, Belle's neighbors saw a hard-working woman managing her property. They knew her as someone who performed difficult physical tasks and maintained an independent life. Nothing about her public identity immediately suggested the possibility of murder. Her alleged crimes were hidden not because she avoided society completely, but because she blended into it. She operated through familiar institutions and accepted social practices. Newspaper advertisements, marriage correspondence, property ownership, and farming were all ordinary parts of early 20th century life. The tragedy was that these ordinary elements became tools within a much darker pattern. The men who traveled to Belle's farm were not simply victims of random violence. They were individuals who believed they were making decisions that would improve their futures. Many were immigrants who had worked hard to establish themselves in America. They had savings, property, and personal hopes. They responded to Belle's advertisements because they wanted companionship and stability. The promise of marriage offered something deeply meaningful, the possibility of no longer facing life alone. Their trust became the foundation upon which investigators believed Belle built her scheme. This aspect of the case remains one of the most painful. The victims were not merely names listed in historical records. They were people with families, memories, and aspirations. Andrew Helgelien, Sommo, Henry Gurhord, Olaf Lindum, Ole Dutsterk, Olaf Svenherud, and the other men connected to Belle's farm all represented individual lives interrupted. Many traveled believing they were moving toward happiness. Instead, their journeys ended in tragedy. The investigation eventually gave some victims recognition, but it could not restore what had been taken from them or provide complete answers to their families. The uncertainty surrounding the number of victims also remains one of the most troubling parts of the case. Investigators confirmed several individuals through available evidence, but the true scale of the crimes may never be known. At least 14 victims are generally considered to have been identified or strongly connected to Bell. However, some historians believe the number could have been significantly higher, possibly reaching 20, 30, or even 40. The difficulty lies in the passage of time, incomplete records, and the possibility that many disappearances were never connected to the farm. At the beginning of the 20th century, a person could disappear with surprisingly little documentation. Long-distance travel was common, communication was slower, and law enforcement systems were not organized in the way they are today. These conditions created opportunities for disappearances to remain unexplained. Bell's alleged method depended heavily on this reality. By encouraging men to travel alone and limit communication about their plans, she created circumstances where their absence could initially appear ordinary rather than suspicious. Families might wonder why letters stopped arriving, but without immediate evidence of danger, authorities had few reasons to intervene. By the time concern became serious, important evidence may have already disappeared. The investigation of the Gunniss farm also demonstrated the limitations of early 20th century forensic science. Today, investigators have access to advanced DNA testing, digital records, surveillance systems, and national databases. In 1908, authorities worked with far fewer resources. They had to rely on physical evidence, witness statements, documents, and careful observation. When they discovered incomplete and dismembered remains, they faced enormous challenges. Identifying victims was often difficult, and determining exactly how each person died was sometimes impossible. The lack of modern technology left many questions unanswered. The mystery of Bell's possible escape became the defining element that separated this case from many other criminal investigations. If she died in the fire, then the case represented the discovery of a hidden killing operation that ended with the suspect's death. If she escaped, then it represented something even more extraordinary. A suspected serial killer who successfully disappeared after investigators began uncovering her crimes. Both possibilities have fascinated historians and the public for generations. However, the responsible conclusion is that neither theory has been proven completely. The evidence allows for both interpretations, but it does not provide absolute certainty. The official conclusion that Bell died in the fire remains based on the assumption that the headless body recovered from the ruins belonged to her. The escape theory remains based on inconsistencies surrounding that body, Bell's financial actions before the fire, and statements attributed to Ray Lamphere. Neither side possesses enough evidence to eliminate all doubt. The legacy of Bell Gunniss is also shaped by the way society remembers female offenders. At the time, the idea of a woman committing multiple murders shocked the public. Many people associated violence with male criminals, making Bell's case particularly disturbing. Her ability to present herself as a respectable widow while investigators later connected her to numerous deaths challenged common assumptions about who could become a dangerous offender. However, the focus on her identity should not overshadow the suffering of her victims. The importance of the case lies not in creating a legend around Bell, but in understanding how deception and exploitation can harm vulnerable people. Over time, the story of Bell Gunniss has appeared in books, articles, and discussions of American crime history. Each retelling has contributed to keeping the mystery alive, but it has also created a responsibility to distinguish documented facts from speculation. The dramatic elements of the case, the hidden graves, the suspected escape, and the unknown victim count naturally attract attention. Yet behind those elements is a real investigation involving real people who experienced devastating loss. The farm in La Porte no longer exists as the center of a criminal investigation, but its place in history remains. It represents a reminder that appearances can be misleading and that crimes often remain hidden not because they are invisible, but because they are disguised as ordinary life. The Belle Gunness case continues to raise questions about trust, vulnerability, and the difficulty of uncovering the truth when evidence is incomplete. In the end, the greatest mystery is not only whether Belle Gunness escaped. It is how many lives were lost before anyone realized what was happening. The men who traveled to her farm believe they were following a path toward a better future. They carried their savings, their hopes, and their faith in another person. Their disappearance revealed a tragedy far larger than one criminal case. It revealed how easily hope could be manipulated and how long suffering could remain hidden. More than 100 years later, the questions remain. How many victims were truly buried beneath the farm? What happened to the missing men whose names may never be known? Was Belle Gunness buried among the ashes of her home, or did she disappear into another life? The answers may never be discovered, but the story of Belle Gunness remains because it represents one of the most unsettling possibilities in criminal history. That someone could commit unimaginable acts, leave behind evidence of terrible crimes, and still vanish into uncertainty. The murder farm stands as a reminder that behind every mystery are real people, real losses, and real lives that deserve to be remembered.